All right, Father, be with us, Lord, as we look at the words of your servant David this morning. May these words be an encouragement to us. In your name, amen. I want to talk about seasons of transition. That's what we're going to look at this morning. Probably next week, too. It's going to be easier to see the white letters on the projector ahead of me, on top of me, as opposed to the screens, but sometimes that's just what happens. But I realized as I was thinking about where I wanted to go and where was God speaking to me and what was the most important thing going on, that we are in a period of transition as a church, and many of us are in seasons of transition in our lives. Seasons of transition are those phases of our life where we're moving from and we're acutely aware that we're moving from one Sitz im Leben to another. Sitz im Leben is a German phrase. I could have just told you what it means in English, but I'm giving you something you can use. It means situation in life. And it's a phrase, Sitz im Leben, that stuck with me ever since seminary when I first heard it. And we live, in situations in life. We all have a Sitz im Leben that we're most comfortable in. And there are moments in our life where we feel like our situation is pretty stable. And then there are and we become accustomed to it, become very familiar with it. And then you go through a transition phase, and then you enter into another Sitz im Leben. You enter into another situation in your life that may or may not bring you comfort. And it will probably be uncomfortable at first until you adjust to it, and then that becomes your new normal. We're not usually in the same Sitz im Leben for long, and the older I've gotten, the more I've begun to experience how much transition we actually go through. Not every transition is equally as challenging, but we are often in periods of transition. Consider some of the transitions that people are going through just in our church. Our children who just left. And some of them who are in, the younger grades right now in children's ministry, they're entering school for the very first time. Going to preschool at age 3 or 4. Others are moving up a grade. You move from, at least in the school that my children attend, after second grade, you move to a different campus for third grade. All of a sudden you have new classrooms and new media centers and new gym teachers and all of these things that you didn't experience the year before. There's a transition that happens between the 7th and 8th grade, as many children in here are experiencing. You go from 7th to 8th grade, and all of a sudden you realize you're the oldest kids on the campus, and you're significantly older. You're only 1 year older, but there's major differences that happen between 6th and 8th grade, and even 7th and 8th grade. And all of a sudden you realize I'm the oldest person on this campus. Like, the kids on this campus are looking to me now for leadership. And then the next year, you face the sudden recognition that you're not quite so old after all, as you transition to a new building and you become a freshman. And now you're little, and you're with all these adult-sized humans. I've talked about the opportunity to work with high school boys, and as freshmen, they come in, and they're scrawny, and they're all shorter than me. And then by senior year, I'm looking up to, granted, I'm working with basketball players, so they tend to be taller than me, but I'm looking up to all these men who are full-sized grown men. And I go, what happened to you in 4 years? What did you eat that I'm not eating? Or maybe the problem is I'm still eating what you're eating, and that's an issue. Then you go to high school, and you settle into that reality. 4 years feels like forever. And then suddenly it's over, and you go to college, or you find a job, and you're in the season of transition where you wonder what it's going to be like in your new home, all the freedom that you have when you come out of high school, and whether you're working or you're going to college or whatever. Maybe you got a job at a high school and you feel like you're making all this money. In our own church, there's some people getting engaged or who have gotten engaged, and they're looking forward to getting married. And engagement is a season of transition where you're no longer just dating. That Sitz im Leben that you got used to has changed, and now you're looking forward to a new normal that will come, but you're not into it yet. And then you get married and you get pregnant. And all of a sudden you're thrown into this chaos of becoming first-time parents, wondering how in the world you're going to figure all that out, while being simultaneously excited to see your child come into the world and knowing that everything is going to change. Then you have one kid. You figure that out, sort of. Then you have another one. Maybe you have a third. Maybe you have a fourth. And along the way, you're sending your own kids off to school. even though you very clearly still remember your own first day of kindergarten? My kindergarten teacher was Mrs. Sanders. She taught me in what is now the Media Center at the Midland Park campus of Eastern Christian School. I met Justin Van Genderen that first day because he went to my church and we both like to play with blocks. And then before you know it, like at least Melissa and I did this week, you send your oldest kids off to college, even though you remember their first day of kindergarten much more clearly than your own. And you're excited and nervous as you send them out into a world that you can no longer control. You can no longer curate their experiences to keep them from things that might cause them harm. And you realize that your Sitzim Leben is no longer adding children to your household, it's sending them away. You're in a period of time where, not that your kids are, they might move back in, whatever, but you realize the number of children whose home address is my house is getting smaller, not larger. And before you know it, they're all out of the house, all the kids that you had. But they're still your kids, and you begin referring to young adults as kids, even though you know they're adults, but they're your kids' age or younger. And then one day you realize that you're old enough to be the youth pastor's father, not just in theory, not just biologically, but because you've been married longer than he's been alive. And you really start spiraling. Let me tell you, that's a rough realization. And then you're the parents of the person getting married. And then you're a grandparent. And then you're like my mother and father-in-law, Tom and Sue. After they begin saying things like, I can't wait for the kids to arrive. And you realize they're not talking about your kids, they're talking about you, their children, even though we're all in our mid-40s. And then, as happened a couple of weeks ago, we're vacationing with our extended family, and the family leaves, and Tom and Sue are really sad for about 24 hours that all their grandkids are gone. And then they realize that they're in a Sitzim Leben where they can just sit there and be quiet and do whatever they want with just the two of them, and they settle into reading books and enjoying that new normal. And then you begin parenting your parents, who, if you're lucky enough that they're still alive, they're often old, so as to need constant care. And then they will pass, and then you will be the ones who will need care. And along the way, there are life transitions like moving to a new job or a new state. Or as a church, we're experiencing transition of having Chris, who served us so well, and we love, go through a transition himself, and we're going through ours. And maybe after examining all of that, we might say, well, perhaps life is not about moving from one Sitzim Leben to the next, but perhaps life is actually about moving from one transition to the next. As if life is not about being settled, but is actually constantly navigating the winds of change. Perhaps life is transition. And if that's the case, then what it means is that life is one big, extended, unending, unknown. So what does the Bible have to say about that? And as I reflected on that this week, the verse that resonated in my head was that God has written in his book all the days of my life before one of them has yet to be. That as I go through seasons of transition from one unknown to the next, there's not a single day that I endure, that you endure, that God does not already know about and has not already written in his book before even one of them has yet come to be. So if you have ears to hear and hearts to believe, we're going to look at this psalm this morning that gives us the foundations for the unknowns and the transition in our own lives and the lives of those around us. God has written every day of my life in his book before any of them were yet to be. If you have a Bible, open up to Psalm 139. You can read along on the screen if you want. But Psalm 139 is written as a song. It's intended to be sung in public worship. Whenever you come across a psalm that says something like "to the choir master" at the beginning of it, this is an important piece of the text. That's not an add-on. That's something to help you, the reader, understand what this was written for. And the idea of any worship song, just like the ones we sing today, is that it's intended to be repeated over and over and over so that you eventually absorb the content. The words become teaching tools for us and encouragement to us. And if you think about how easy it is to memorize the words of your favorite song, that's the idea. You memorize the words. You don't even realize you're memorizing the words to your favorite songs, and then one day you're just singing along in the car. Or as happens to me, depending on what Sirius XM radio station I'm on, all of a sudden a 90s rap song will come on, and I know all the words, and just as clearly as if I had memorized it yesterday. Well, the reason that you sing worship songs over and over and over, or read the Psalms over and over and over, is that their content is generally better than a 90s rap song. And so it's better to memorize these than those. But if you can memorize those, you can memorize these. All right, Psalm 139 goes this way, to the choir master, a psalm of David. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down, and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You hem me in, behind and before, and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high. I cannot attain it. The place that the psalmist starts out is with God's sovereignty. He makes two claims about God's sovereignty over us and our situation, and they form the foundation for going through transition. To be sovereign means not only that God is the ultimate authority, but that he is self-governing. When we talk about a sovereign nation, we mean that a nation has an authoritative government and can therefore govern itself. When we talk about a sovereign God, we're speaking of supreme authority, and therefore God is self-governing. There is no governing over God himself, and that sovereignty gives us confidence. The psalm talks about it in two ways. God not only knows our paths, but he knows what our thoughts are along the path. So in other words, God knows what we're going to endure, and he knows what we're going to think about as we are enduring it. Sometimes I think we use this idea that God knows what we're thinking as a scare tactic, or at least that's how we often feel about it. I'm sure if you've been on social media, you've seen a meme somewhere where somebody is standing at the pearly gates of heaven, and God says, "Can I read your group texts?" And it's like supposed to frighten you into thinking like, "Dear God, please no one ever see my group texts." Because all of us have said things or thought things or done things that we go, I really hope God doesn't know that, and that is kind of what scares us about God knowing our thoughts. But the reality, and what David wants us to reflect on, is that actually God's knowledge of our thoughts should be a great comfort to those who call God their Father, because it means you don't have to hide. You don't have to worry about what you're really thinking. If God has called you his child, then he's well aware of what you're thinking. And so when we go through transitions in life, a lot of times it's coupled with a mixture of emotions. Some are good, some are bad, or we think are bad. You know, when you get married, for example, you know that you probably aren't going to hang out with some of your friends as much. You know, you're going to go couple up, you're going to get married, you're going to have your own place, and you think to yourself, I kind of feel bad about that. But then there's a part of you that's like, thank God I don't have to hang out with those people anymore. Or you have a kid, and you're like, thank God I have a good excuse not to have to do stuff. Or when school starts in a few weeks, you know as well as I do that you're going to be really sad to not have your kids around. But also you're going to throw a party at 8:30 a.m. after drop-off that first day. And of course there's emotions of fear, distrust of God's plans, the thoughts you have that maybe God doesn't know what he's doing, or that you might be making a wrong choice, or that you aren't prepared enough or adequate for your next Sitz im Leben. And David is reminding us it's a good thing that God already knows. God knows your thoughts. You can't hide from him, which means you don't have to hide those thoughts and emotions. He says that God hems us in from behind, in front, and even on top of us, as if his hand is covering us. If you were with us last fall when we looked at the book of Job, one of the themes I pointed out was that for Job, this hedging in, God's protection of him actually felt like a prison, because he didn't feel like he could really find out the answers of what God was up to. The hedge that was keeping him safe felt like it was keeping him in the dark. And part of the lesson there was, God knows that. Don't hide your emotions from God, which Job never does. He maintains his line of thinking. But even when things were as bleak as they possibly could be, the comfort for Job was that he knew that God could have stopped the suffering, but he chose not to. We have this modern view that emerged from the Enlightenment where we want to prove or disprove God's existence based on a rational argument. And one of those so-called rational arguments is that if God were all-loving and all-powerful, he would stop suffering. But if suffering exists, then God must not be all-loving or all-powerful, so he either doesn't exist or he's irrelevant. That line of thinking is not rational to the Hebrew thinker of the Old Testament, who believed that God was sovereign. God may not do things the way that we wish he would. We may not understand God, but what David says is, I know that you have this hedge around me. I know you've hemmed me in, and even in a period that I don't understand. I know that whatever comes about in my life, whatever steps I take, thoughts I have, they could be stopped, but you've chosen not to. And the reason he's okay with that is because he says that knowledge is unattainable for me. That's too high for me. We can't fathom God, but God can fathom us because God knows us, he knows our way, he knows our thoughts. That's why we can trust God's sovereignty. And by the way, you don't want a God that you can fathom, at least not all the way. You don't want a God that you can keep within your puny little mind. Like if you said, or if I said, I understand God fully, you would think, well, then God must not be that complex. But our foundation is not just God's sovereignty, it's his presence. Psalm 139, verse 7. Where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me and the light about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to you, the night is bright as the day, for darkness is as light with you. It's not just God's sovereignty, it's his presence. David goes on to say, and he asks a rhetorical question, where am I going to run? Like, where am I going to flee from God's presence? And sometimes we read that and think to ourselves, well, like we want to flee. We want to get away. And maybe because we're conditioned to thinking of God's presence or his sovereignty as a frightening thing. But for David, it's not frightening, it's comforting. He's not trying to figure out a way to flee from God. He's praising God because there's nowhere he can go to get away from God. So he uses these metaphors to talk about it. He says, if I go up to the heavens, you're there. If I descend or make my bed in Sheol, you're there. This is a metaphor for going up and going down. Heaven is up. You go up into the sky, into the heavens, and you would go down into Sheol. Sheol is the place of darkness. It's down. You go down into it. Or to emphasize the metaphor further, David says, I can ascend or I can descend. And descending is like you would get into your bed. You would descend into your bed. But for David, he descends not just into his bed, but he says, if I make my bed all the way at the depths of Sheol. So if I go as high as I can go, or as low as I can go, you're there. Second, he says, if I go as far as I can to the east, or as far as I can to the west, you're there. The metaphor here is the wings of the morning, or we might say the sunrise. That's not as poetic. So he says, if I take the wings of the morning, in other words, if I go all the way to the east, you're there. And then if you're standing in the land of Israel, what's to your west? It's a sea that goes as far as the eye can fathom. And so he says, if I go all the way to the east, to the place the sun rises, I go to the depths, the uttermost parts of the sea, as far as I can fathom. You're still there. So not only up or down, or east or west, but also darkness and light. No matter what we perceive to be true of our surroundings, whether we think it's dark or light, which was another theme in the book of Job. Job is constantly complaining he's in the darkness. No matter what we think, it's always as light to God. And then what we often miss about this psalm, because we tend to pull these lines out of context, is that David uses another analogy to demonstrate God's care for us even when we are in a place of darkness. Psalm 139, verse 13. For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. It's not just God's sovereignty, not just his presence, but his purpose. He's not comparing the womb of a mother to a place of darkness, the way that darkness is sometimes used in Scripture, where it's used as a metaphor for evil or a dangerous place. He's saying that whatever is happening in a mother's womb, only God knows. We may understand it scientifically now, in the 21st century, the way that the ancients clearly did not. We understand the process of embryo formation and the process of an embryo growing and forming in the womb of a mother. But there's still a period of time where a mother is pregnant and no one knows. She doesn't know. No one knows. A baby begins to grow in a mother's womb, and even the mother doesn't know it's there. But God knows. God knows us even when no one else even knows we exist. We are there in our mother's womb being made in secret. Think about that. Being formed in secret. There is a time in your life when you are a real human being, made of the stuff that we're made of, being grown in your mother's womb, when the only one to know that you even exist is God. And God is there in the darkness with you, secretly forming you. Just you and the creator of the universe. And he's secretly forming you. And I'm not talking about the idea of God's knowledge of you before the foundation of the world, which is a biblical concept, but right here, what David is saying is that there's this moment of secret where God is forming you and only God knows. Whatever fabric you're made of, the unformed substance of an embryo, God was there working in secret. It was God's delight to form you. God delighted in you and you alone in that moment as he formed you, the creator of the God of the universe and the two cells that made you, you. God was forming you in secret. And then eventually he tells your mom, and she usually throws up. And if you're pregnant, mothers know that all too well. But there's another line here that I want us to see, and it's actually an alternate translation that we didn't read. The line that we read was, I praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. And that's one way of interpreting it. But if you have a study Bible, there's another way. It might point you to another translation, which I actually like better personally. Not because I read Hebrew, although there is a variance in the Hebrew word here, so I'm sure Lon will need to correct me. I did check with my friend George, though, and he agreed. But the translation is this, not I praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made, but I praise you because I am fearfully set apart. I praise you because I am fearfully set apart. If we translate it as wonderfully made, we're continuing to focus on the secret of God as he forms us in the womb, and we should indeed marvel at that wonder. But to be fearfully set apart, what it means is that as God was creating you, he was not simply forming your physical being, he was forming the path that he had marked out for you. That you've been set apart for a particular assignment, for a purpose, so that in the womb, the secret creation of you was not just the stuff that makes you you, but it was the path that you were going to walk. All the days that he's numbered for you before any of those days were yet to be. God's creation and purposes are so far beyond creation that this is what makes them wonderful. That they're wonderful because he designed you specifically for the path that he called you to walk in the womb. And that, I think, is what leads towards David's confidence that our very days are set apart by God before we walk in them. Because he says, when it was just in secret, when it was just between me and you, when I was just a couple of cells and you were the creator God making me in secret, you not only formed me, but you formed the path and the purposes that you had for me. Which is why David goes on to say, if all this is true, and you know my ways, and you know my thoughts, and you formed not only the physical substance that makes me me, but in doing so, you formed a path for me, what now? Well, not only do I comfort in you knowing my thoughts, but I want to know yours. How precious to me are your thoughts, O God. How vast is the sum of them. If I would count them, they are more than the sand. I awake, and I am still with you. Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God. O men of blood, depart from me. They speak against you with malicious intent. Your enemies take your name in vain. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord, and do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with complete hatred. I count them my enemies. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. I watched a Netflix special earlier this week of a comedian magician, and he was doing a bit on a Rubik's Cube, and he said that there were, listen to this number, there were 43 quintillion different combinations possible on a standard 3x3x3 Rubik's Cube. Do you know how many grains of sand there are on the earth? 7.5 quintillion. There's more combinations on a Rubik's Cube than there are grains of sand on the earth. So if the psalmist was writing today, he might say, how precious are your thoughts? If I could count them, they're more than the combinations on a Rubik's Cube, which doesn't flow as nicely, so I'm glad he didn't say that. But it is more accurate. Given all of this foundation of God's sovereignty and his presence and his purpose, David concludes by reminding us that we should love the thoughts of God. This is really what he's getting at. The conclusion of this is if all of this is true, if God's sovereign, if God is present, if God's formed out the purposes of my days, then what I should really be focusing on is not my thoughts, the ones that God knows from the beginning of the psalm, not my thoughts and how I feel about it, but what I should really be focusing on is God's thoughts about it. What does God think about my transition? What is God trying to get me to do? Why is God disrupted me with this transition where I was comfortable in the Sitzim Lieben I was in, and now I'm moving forward towards this other one, which I don't know if it's going to be as comfortable or not, where I have to go and it's different and change happens. Why is God doing this? Well, those are the thoughts we should be focusing on. He goes, your thoughts are far outnumbered what I can count. Vast is the sum of them, but I want to know them. I want to know them more. And the Bible, by the way, not only do we know God's thoughts, but we actively oppose the thoughts that are against God. And the Bible is not shy of, and especially in the Psalms and other places of lament, where it's not shy about using words like love and hate. Like, I love God's thoughts and I hate anything that opposes him. And we want to soften that because a lot of times we don't want to use the word hate. There is a place for hating all that stands in opposition to God. There is a place for hating enemies of God. Now, the danger in our case is that we don't always know who the enemies of God are. Like, it's easy to say that person's an enemy of God, but we're all enemies. We were all enemies of God. And so we need to be really careful that we don't ostracize enemies of God. In David's day, he's living as a nation of Israel. And so any foreign nation that was attacking the nation of Israel was by default an enemy of God. So in his mind, there was more of a one-to-one comparison than what we can make. But there is a place for hating the enemies of God. And the reason David hates them is because he hates that they stand in opposition to God. See, we tend to think of things, when we think of enemies of God, as people who stand in opposition to us. And they stand in opposition to what we want. Most of the time, when we think about people standing in opposition to God, what we're actually talking about is people standing in opposition to our freedoms, which is a way different thing. You know, like when COVID hit and we were, upset about being able to maybe worship publicly, we said people are opposed to God. No, they weren't opposed to God. They were opposed to our freedom to do something. That's a much different thing. We shouldn't hate those people. We should seek to love them and figure that out. But we do need to hate those things that stand in opposition to God. And transition, this is one of the reasons that transition occurs in our lives, because transition forces us out of what we have become comfortable with so that we're required to stand on God's sovereignty, his presence, and his purpose. We're required to stop thinking about what we're comfortable with or what our preferences are, and we have to start thinking about what God is doing. We're praying to show us God's thoughts. What is God doing? And transition necessarily makes us venture into the unknown. It moves us from what we think we know now to what we don't know and definitely don't know about what is coming. It pushes us to the place where we have to say, only God knows. And those are the thoughts that I want to understand. I want to know what God thinks of my Sitzim Lieben. I want to know what God is thinking. I want to be going where God is leading me. And transition is the means through which we come to understand where that place is, because transition is the place of dependency. Transition is the place of trusting God. Would you ever really need to trust God if you were never forced to move from this Sitzim Lieben to the next? Would you ever really need to trust him? Because you can become comfortable and known and you think, I've got this, and then you're forced out. This is why the psalmist closes with a really dangerous prayer. It's right here. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts. Okay, try me, another way of saying put me on trial. What else is transition but putting you on trial and your dependency on God? And see if there's any grievous way in me and lead me in the way everlasting. That's how the song concludes. What do we lean on when we go through transition in our lives? What is it that gives us confidence? What is it that can help us know that our paths and our days have been written for us in the book of God even before any one of them has come to pass? It's confidence and trust in a God who knows, a God who's present, and a God whose ways are everlasting. Transition breaks us free from confidence in ourselves and forces us to have confidence in God. So perhaps life really is about transition, so that we can learn to trust God more every day. And so rather than avoid it, maybe we need to pray this prayer. Search me out. Put me on trial. Find out what's really going on in my heart so that I can be led in the way that's everlasting. That's a prayer of confidence, but it's a prayer that's going to lead you into transition. Because in all likelihood, whatever your current Sitzim Leben is right now, is not your destination, it's a pit stop. It's a pit stop along the way, everlasting. And you're going to have to leave it behind as you make your journey forward. And I think that's the point of transition, that we would know that God is our foundation. That's the gospel. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for the words of this psalm, Lord, which for many of us may even resonate. Maybe we have memorized this song in the past. Maybe our eyes are open to it in a new way. Maybe, Lord, we see the ways in which our current situation, our current transition is really about dependence and building dependence on you. I pray, Lord, that no matter what the transition is we're going through or enduring, I pray that you would be with us, that you would help us to know your thoughts and not ours. Lord, that we would be willing to stand on that rock. Be with us, Lord, in your name. Amen.